Welcome back to the Oxendine Law Podcast. Again, your host, Jarrod Oxendine, co-host Christine Palmer. And today we're talking about how do you divide debt. So we're talking about dividing credit cards. We're talking about dividing mortgages, any and all type of debt that's acquired during the marriage. And the first thing I'll point out is that dividing debt actually is a good thing that we do in divorce, because you can actually use your divorce as an opportunity to walk away, potentially, if we have enough assets there, debt-free. So this debt is burning you down and bogging you down during the marriage. We, as part of your divorce case, might be able to unload all that debt and let you start off with a clean slate. So let's dive right into it and talk about how we divide debt. Not sure if you looked at our previous podcast episode, but the last episode, we talked about how we divide assets, and we talked about how dividing assets is pursuant to a theory called equitable division, which means you divide assets according to what's fair. Same thing with debt.
That's right.
Debt is also pursuant to equitable division, which means we divide debt according to what's fair. And what's fair in dividing debt is not always 50-50, is it, Christine?
It's not. No, there's a couple ways that dividing debt that is not just straight up a 50-50 makes sense. I think the number one and most common is which party incurred the debt. Now, if we're talking about wife stays home and she goes to Costco and runs up the cart getting, the toilet paper and the baby formula, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about she loves shopping sprees, and she has a card at Victoria's Secret and one at Old Navy and one at every department store that exists.
She's got a spending problem.
And she's got $5,000 and $6,000 balances on all these little store cards that the husband is completely and wholly unaware of. He has no idea. He sees that Visa bill with the Kroger and the gas, and he sees the Costco card come in, and he's paying that off. But he doesn't know all these little cards exist, these little retail cards. That sometimes can just be put in her column. It didn't benefit the marriage at all.
And then take it a step further, Christine, because I love that example. He's bailed her out several times before during the marriage. So she builds up this secret debt, and all of a sudden she's crying and she falls to him and says, I've got all these credit cards and then I can't meet these payments. They're about to come after me and they're about to sue me and they're going to garnish my wages, yada, yada, yada. And so he digs into his retirement account and he liquidates a part of his retirement account and he pays the debt off.
And he says, cut those up. Cut those credit cards up.
Yes.
And he trusts that she's going to do it.
And she gets new ones. And it's an endless cycle.
Correct.
What happens to that debt?
So that debt, it can be argued, needs to be the responsibility of the debtor, the one that incurred it. That is not a marital debt. That is a strong argument for that is separate incurred debt. So that's an argument for separate incurred debt. Also, how often do we see families, not everybody wakes up and says, all right, okay, it's time to be divorced. Let me go see a lawyer. It is very common for parties to start this natural separation potentially a year even before they've come to see us. They want to test drive some things. They don't even know if they want to be divorced. So they're going to go ahead and separate finances. They may establish separate residences. Sometimes they're just living completely separate lives already. And then one party is responsible and the other's not. And they want to come in at the time of this legal divorce and say, oh, all this was incurred during the marriage. This is all marital debt. We can look at those statements and say, hey, ma'am, you moved out on this date. And so he can't be responsible for the $70,000 that you incurred between Rooms to Go and Pier 1 and all these other places, furnishing that new apartment of yours. You incurred that individually. That's separate debt. So those are some examples of what we don't equitably divide. Those are separate debts.
True. Yeah, I love that example of dividing the debt as of the date of separation when the parties are no longer living together. Not always a successful argument, but like you said, if you have parties that have been living separately for a long period of time, that's a good argument.
Yeah, but there's another side of that. Let's say that I felt like I was forced out of the house, whether due to physical violence or just emotional overload, or I'm just not comfortable in my own home. And I feel like I'm not safe here. And if I'm going to get through this divorce process, I'm sure not going to be able to do it here. So I feel like I have to go get an apartment. And he won't give me any money. He won't allow me. He won't give me any help. So what do? I turn to credit cards because I don't have a choice. So now all my gas is on credit cards. My groceries to feed our kids are on credit cards. And I really had to essentially flee. I mean, I don't want to say it that severely, but you did. You had to do what you had to do to protect yourself and your kids. And now you've incurred debt. Yeah, it's separate, but that's marital. That was still a part of getting out of the marriage. So just because it happened after the date of separation doesn't automatically make it separate.
That's true, especially if the other person makes more money. Let's say in the scenario you just gave, this person's fleeing for whatever reason. They've got a bad, toxic household environment. They got to get out, and their spouse refuses to give them access to any money.
Right.
Doesn't put any money in their bank account, doesn't give them access to any money to pay for normal and ordinary expenses. We're talking about gas and food and clothes and just the day-to-day stuff that you need to stay alive.
Right.
Then that person can actually argue that their spouse should pay all the debt because they didn't pay any support during that time period.
That's correct.
Let's say we don't have one of those scenarios. We're not talking about illegitimate debt that was acquired for a spendthrift wife or husband. We're not talking about debt that was spent on a girlfriend or a boyfriend. We're talking about legitimate household, ordinary, normal expenses that were acquired during the marriage for ordinary and normal things that just take the day-to-day run of a household. How do we divide that? Now, I would say you go in assuming 50-50. However, if you've got one spouse that makes more money than the other, it's almost always a successful argument, depending on how the assets are divided, that person should pay a larger portion of the debt because they can afford to pay a larger portion of the debt. Now, if both parties are making the same amount of money, then they should equally divide that marital debt.
Right.
But if you got one spouse that makes a lot more money than the other, you've got a really good argument to make that person should pay a larger portion of the debt.
Well, that actually is the equitable division in a situation where one spouse is a greatly higher earning. Because if you think about it, if one spouse earns 70% of the income, it only makes sense that they should also be responsible, conversely, for approximately 70% of the debt. So that really isn't necessarily an argument for unequitable. That actually is the equitable solution in that scenario.
That's it. So let's talk about how you protect yourself financially when we divide the debt. So we've already divided it. We figure out who's supposed to pay for what assets everybody's keeping. All right, here's the example I'm going to give. Let's say you get to keep the house, all right? But your spouse's name is on the debt. Your spouse's name is on the mortgage. So it's a jointly titled house. You're both on the mortgage, and it's determined in the divorce, either by agreement or court order, that you get to keep the house. And you get to live in the house, and your spouse has to move out, and you've got to pay for the house. The inquiry doesn't end there, right? Because if you're that spouse that didn't keep the house, your name's still tied to that mortgage. So you always want to make sure that there's a provision in place that requires the party that's keeping the asset that the debt's tied to, especially if your name's on it, only if your name's on it, right? But this is the big concern, that they have to do something to get your name off that debt. So in the house example, you would say that they have to refinance that debt out of your name within a certain amount of time. Maybe it's 30 days, maybe it's 60 days, 90 days, whatever is reasonable, whatever y'all can agree on. And if they can't get it refinanced or refuse to, then it's sold. Now, they may get to keep all the proceeds, but we got to make sure that your name is not tied to debt that's solely in your ex-spouse's control, because if they don't make the payment, that's going to affect your credit.
Correct. And I've also seen the same sort of scenario in IRS tax debt. So a lot of times there may only be one income earning spouse in a marriage. And so the non-income earning spouse technically files a joint tax return with their spouse because they're getting all the credits and they want every deduction that they can get. So you've filed a married tax return for two individuals, but one person was the one really that had the only income coming in. So if it's gonna make sense to say, well, he or she keeps the debt. They were the income earner. They keep the debt. But there has to be some sort of provision to protect your name and your interest in that debt. You can't just trust that they're eventually going to pay it off and hope for the best. There has to be some sort of provision of indemnify and hold harmless, or even that they would be responsible for your attorney's fees if you have to retain an IRS attorney to negotiate that tax debt. So the responsibility that comes with the debt has to be managed as well, not just who pays the debt, but how is it paid and when is it paid, and all of the terms that govern not just whose responsibility of it is it, but exactly how that's going to be remedied.
Yeah, because in the example you gave of a joint tax return filing, and it's determined by the IRS that there's an amount owed, there's a deficiency, the IRS doesn't care. They can come after either one of you or both of you.
That's right.
And so if there's nothing in your divorce decree that says in the event of an audit who's responsible, then the IRS handles it. Whoever they come after, that's who pays it.
Yeah.
And what Christine's talking about is if you have a provision in your agreement that says in the event of an audit, either husband's solely responsible or wife's solely responsible, and they're going to indemnify and hold the other party harmless. And to the extent, like you said, the other party has to incur attorney's fees to defend it, that person is going to be responsible for those fees. Now you have a course of action against your ex-spouse if the IRS comes after you. Frankly, according to what we just said, they would need to step in and pay it. If they did not, and you suffer damages because you end up having to pay the IRS or you get garnished, you can now come back after your spouse post-decree through a contempt action and get the court to address that situation.
That's right. So it's just smart to make sure that everything governing debt is spelled out in as much detail as possible. Dates, deadlines, all of that. And a lot of times we also dictate where debts are going to be paid from. Sometimes it's, okay, well, we have all of these debts and we've determined what they are. They're going to be paid from the proceeds of the sale of the house before any division happens. And then whatever's left goes 50-50 between the parties. But sometimes it's smart to just go ahead and determine that source of income right now of how are these debts going to be paid. And then if it's all spelled out, like you said, if one party doesn't do what they're supposed to do, now you have remedies as opposed to just walking away saying, well, he or she's responsible for the debt. But then what happens if they don't?
Short and sweet episode, folks, but it was straight to the point. It contained helpful information. Again, handling debt during a divorce can be stressful. It can be complex. But if you implement these strategies, if you cross your T's and you dot your I's, you can actually come out of this potentially debt-free or maybe even a better financial position than you were when you first filed for divorce. So we appreciate you always for tuning in. We're on all major platforms. If you're on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe, and we will see you on the next episode.